The silent era. The silent era of film lasted from the late 1880s through the late 1920s, and it wasn't actually silent. Most films were accompanied by live music, sometimes just a piano, other times a full orchestra. Dialogue was shown on intertitles while actors relied on facial expressions and exaggerated body language to tell the story. By 1927, over 20,000 silent films had been made in the United States alone, though the Library of Congress estimates that 75% of them are now lost. That's over 15,000 films gone. The earliest silent films were only a few seconds long, but by the 1910s, feature-length storytelling had taken over. Studios like Biograph, Edison, and Vitagraph led early production, but by the 1920s, giants like Paramount, Universal, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had taken over. Directors such as D.W. Griffith pushed the boundaries with longer films, cross-cutting, and close-ups, techniques that shaped modern filmmaking. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, released in 1915, ran over 3 hours and became the first American blockbuster. But it also sparked major controversy due to its racist content, which can't be ignored when discussing its impact. Around that time, film began transitioning from a novelty into a legitimate industry. Theaters started getting bigger, and the idea of the movie palace was born. These were massive venues that could seat thousands, complete with chandeliers, balconies, and pipe organs. In 1920, there were around 20,000 movie theaters in the United States. Silent film stars became global celebrities. Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks were household names, pulling in salaries that would be massive, even by today's standards. Chaplin was earning $10,000 a week by 1918. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $200,000 a week today. The standard film length was measured in reels, with each reel lasting about 10 to 15 minutes. A 5-reel film ran about an hour, which was considered a full-length feature. Studios distributed films on nitrate stock, which was highly flammable and deteriorated easily, contributing to the loss of many silent films. The average frame rate was 16 to 18 frames per second, which made motion look unnaturally fast when projected at modern speeds. That's why many people think silent films look sped up, even though that wasn't the intent. Cinematographers had to light scenes heavily, since film stocks were not very sensitive to light. Arc lamps and large banks of lights were used constantly on set. Color wasn't entirely absent either. Techniques like hand tinting, toning, and stencil coloring were common. Some films had sequences in full color using the two-color Technicolor process, which combined red and green hues. This wasn't the vibrant Technicolor seen in later decades, but it was still a significant leap. Intertitles weren't just functional, they were stylized and often designed to match the film's tone. They included quotes, dialogue, or narration, and played a huge role in pacing. Many early directors used them strategically to control the rhythm of the story. Internationally, countries like Germany and the Soviet Union were producing highly influential silent films. German expressionist films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Soviet montage films like Battleship Potemkin introduced stylistic innovations that had a lasting impact. Studios across Europe and Asia developed their own stars, genres, and styles. It wasn't just an American thing. By the mid-1920s, Hollywood had already become the global capital of film production. US films dominated international markets, and stars like Valentino and Garbo had fan bases worldwide. Everything changed in 1927 with The Jazz Singer. But the silent era laid every single foundation that the industry still builds on. Talkies. The era of talkies began in 1927 with the release of The Jazz Singer, which was the first feature-length film to include synchronized spoken dialogue. It used the Vitaphone sound-on-disc system, which played audio from a separate phonograph record synced to the film. While it only had a few minutes of actual talking, its success signaled a major turning point. By 1929, almost every major studio had shifted to sound production. Within 2 years, silent films were essentially gone from mainstream American theaters. Studios had to overhaul everything. Soundproof stages were built to block out ambient noise, and microphones were hidden on set. The earliest microphones had limited range, forcing actors to stay close and still. This killed the exaggerated physical acting style of the silent era. Actors now had to deliver lines clearly and with emotion, which meant that some silent stars lost their careers due to heavy accents or weak vocal delivery. On the other hand, it created opportunities for new talent with strong voices and stage experience. Dialogue coaches and diction training became standard behind the scenes. Technical limitations defined early sound production. Cameras were loud, so they were put in giant soundproof boxes called blimps, which made them hard to move. This led to static scenes, where actors stood still and delivered lines straight into the mic. It wasn't until later advancements like the boom mic and quieter cameras that dynamic camera work returned. Editing also changed. In silent films, quick cuts were common, but early sound editing was limited, so shots were longer. Directors had to rethink pacing and composition to fit the constraints of audio. Major studios like Warner Brothers, MGM, and Fox invested millions in sound technology. The cost of converting theaters was massive, installing sound systems in thousands of venues across the country. By 1930, over 90% of American theaters were equipped for sound. At the same time, a new standard emerged: sound on film. Movietone and photophone systems recorded audio directly onto the film strip, improving sync and reliability. These systems eventually replaced sound on disc entirely. The result was cleaner audio and easier editing. Musicals exploded in popularity. Audiences were fascinated by actors bursting into song, and studios churned out musical after musical. The Broadway Melody, released in 1929, became the first all-talking film to win Best Picture. But not all genres adapted easily. Some filmmakers struggled with the new format, and foreign markets initially resisted dubbed versions of American talkies. Subtitles were introduced, but they weren't always effective. Studios even shot multiple versions of the same film in different languages using the same sets and costumes to cater to international audiences. Box office numbers surged. In 1928, ticket sales were around $900 million. By 1930, they jumped to over $1 billion. The public was obsessed. Studios launched huge advertising campaigns around all talking, all singing, or all dancing features. Theaters boasted the latest audio systems, and moviegoing became a more immersive experience. Sound also transformed film scores. Composers could now write music that perfectly matched scenes instead of relying on theater musicians. Dialogue, sound effects, and music were blended in post-production, laying the groundwork for modern sound design. The transition didn't just change how films sounded, it changed how they were written. Scripts became more like stage plays, and dialogue took center stage. Screenwriters gained influence, and screenplays became more structured. The talkies also boosted the careers of stage-trained actors and brought realism into the spotlight. Performances became subtler, more natural. Theatrical delivery started to give way to more intimate and nuanced acting. It was a shift in tone, pacing, and personality. By the early 1930s, silent film was basically extinct in Hollywood. Charlie Chaplin resisted the transition longer than most, but even he eventually added sound to his films. The era of talkies wasn't just about hearing voices, it was about redefining what film could do. By the way, if you guys want to subscribe, I'm going to start posting a lot here. Thanks. Anyways, the Golden Age. The Golden Age of Hollywood ran from the late 1920s through the early 1960s and was defined by the dominance of the major studio system. 5 studios, MGM, Paramount, Warner Brothers, RKO, and 20th Century Fox, were known as the Big Five. They controlled production, distribution, and exhibition. Alongside them, the Little Three, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists, also played major roles, though they didn't own as many theaters. These companies churned out films on a fixed schedule, often releasing one every week. Actors, writers, and directors were under long-term contracts, with studios dictating their roles, public image, and even personal lives. This era saw the rise of the star system. Studios manufactured celebrity personas and used them to sell tickets. Clark Gable, Katharine Hepburn, Bette Davis, Cary Grant. These weren't just actors, they were brands. Studios even managed their scandals, hiring fixers to keep gossip under control. Some actors were forced to change their names, alter their appearance, or even fake relationships to maintain their image. It was a tightly controlled machine. Technological innovation played a major role. The introduction of Technicolor in the late 1930s led to vibrant, richly colored films that stood out against television's black and white programming. By the 1940s, color was used strategically, especially in musicals and epics. MGM became famous for its lavish color productions, especially under producer Arthur Freed. Animation also took a leap forward during this time. Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, released in 1937, was the first full-length animated feature and a massive box office success. Genre filmmaking flourished. Studios specialized in certain types of movies. Warner Brothers became known for gangster films and gritty dramas. MGM dominated musicals and romantic comedies. Universal carved out a niche with horror films in the 1930s, featuring characters like Dracula and Frankenstein. Westerns, screwball comedies, historical epics, and noir films were released by the dozen. These weren't just trends, they were formulas refined over time to guarantee box office returns. World War II played a huge part in shaping the content of the era. During the war, Hollywood collaborated closely with the US government, producing propaganda films, documentaries, and morale booster. Stars enlisted or toured with the troops, and films often depicted patriotic themes. After the war, those themes shifted toward post-war adjustment, with films exploring the struggles of returning veterans and changing social roles. The Hays Code was in full effect during this time. Enforced strictly from the mid-1930s onward, it dictated what could and couldn't be shown. No profanity, no suggestive content, no sympathetic criminals. Writers and directors had to find clever ways to imply mature themes without breaking the rules. As a result, dialogue often became more layered, using wit and subtext to get around the censors. Box office numbers peaked in the 1940s. In 1946, American theaters sold over 4 billion tickets, more than 10 times the number sold today. People went to the movies weekly, and it was a dominant part of everyday life. Double features, newsreels, and cartoon shorts made movie-going a full evening event. This era created a shared national culture through film. Behind the scenes, however, things were shifting. The antitrust case against Paramount in 1948 started the decline of the studio monopoly. The rise of television in the 1950s drew audiences away from theaters. Studios tried to fight back with gimmicks, 3D, widescreen formats, and stereo sound. Some even produced content specifically to mock or compete with television. Still, the craftsmanship of the golden age remained high. Directors like Alfred Hitchcock, John Ford, and Howard Hawks became household names. Films were carefully storyboarded, scripted, and scored by in-house teams. Every department, from costume design to lighting, operated at a professional level that was hard to match. The Golden Age built the foundation of modern filmmaking, and its influence is still visible in how stories are structured, how stars are marketed, and how studios function today. The post-war era. After World War II ended in 1945, the film industry entered a period of major change. The war had reshaped global politics, society, and economies, and the movies reflected that. In the United States, returning soldiers, changing gender roles, and a growing middle class influenced the kinds of stories being told. Films got darker, more psychological, and more personal. This is when film noir flourished. Directors like Billy Wilder and Otto Preminger crafted moody, cynical films that mirrored the uncertainty of the time. Shadows, voice-over narration, and morally ambiguous characters became standard tools. At the same time, television was on the rise. By 1950, over 4 million American households had a TV. That number tripled by 1955. Hollywood saw it as a direct threat, and studios scrambled to offer something television couldn't. That meant bigger screens, color, widescreen formats like CinemaScope, and eventually surround sound. Theaters upgraded fast, and spectacle became a selling point. This era brought epics with thousands of extras, lavish sets, and huge budgets. Movies were no longer just stories, they were events. The post-war years also brought the collapse of the studio system. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Paramount Pictures that studios could no longer own both production companies and theater chains. That decision forced studios to sell their theaters and ended the vertical integration that had given them complete control. This ruling changed everything. Independent producers started to gain ground, and the old factory model of cranking out movies on backlots started to fade. It became easier for individual voices to emerge. In Europe, things were evolving differently. War-torn cities became backdrops for neorealism, especially in Italy. Directors like Vittorio De Sica and Roberto Rossellini used non-actors, real locations, and stripped-down stories to show poverty, trauma, and survival in a brutally honest way. These films didn't have Hollywood polish, but they had raw emotional power. In Japan, directors like Akira Kurosawa and Kenji Mizoguchi brought international attention to Japanese cinema with precise compositions, moral themes, and historical narratives. Their films influenced an entire generation of Western filmmakers in the decades that followed. Back in the United States, genre films thrived. Westerns, science fiction, and melodramas drew massive crowds. These films often reflected Cold War anxieties. Aliens and monsters represented fears of communism or nuclear war. At the same time, melodramas explored repression, identity, and the cracks forming in the idealized version of post-war life. Directors like Douglas Sirk leaned into lush visuals to critique conformity and societal pressure. The messages were layered, but the visuals were loud. Censorship was still powerful, but cracks were forming. The production code, which had tightly restricted content since the 1930s, faced increasing pushback. Foreign films with more adult content were being imported, and some US filmmakers began to push boundaries. Films started to show more moral complexity, violence, and psychological depth. Audiences were changing and studios had to keep up. Actors also gained more control. The studio contract system weakened, and big names like Marlon Brando and James Dean introduced a new style of performance, naturalistic, emotional, and often unpredictable. This was the rise of method acting, influenced by techniques from the Actors Studio and Stanislavski. The old-school movie star look gave way to grittier, more grounded performances. Audiences connected with this new vulnerability. By the end of the 1950s, international film festivals were becoming cultural landmarks. Cannes, Venice, and Berlin celebrated directors as auteurs. Critics started to focus more on style, structure, and intention, not just box office numbers. The post-war era reshaped the industry from the ground up. Technology changed, the audience changed, and the entire power structure began to shift. Film was no longer just a business, it was becoming art. New Hollywood. New Hollywood, also called the American New Wave, ran from the late 1960s through the early 1980s. This was the period where control shifted away from the studios and into the hands of directors. The collapse of the old studio system, the decline of the production code, and the rise of independent-minded filmmakers all collided at once. The major studios were struggling financially, and many were bought out by corporations that had little interest in storytelling, but were desperate for profit. This opened the door for young directors with bold ideas to take the lead. Studios started taking risks on filmmakers who were heavily influenced by European cinema, particularly the French New Wave and Italian neorealism. These directors valued realism, moral ambiguity, and personal vision over formulaic storytelling. They embraced flawed protagonists, open-ended narratives, and experimental editing. The result was a series of films that broke every rule Hollywood had spent decades enforcing. The Motion Picture Association introduced the film rating system in 1968, replacing the restrictive production code and allowing for more graphic content. Directors like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Brian De Palma, and Robert Altman came out of this movement. Many had film school backgrounds and treated directing like authorship. The term auteur started being applied to them by critics. They were given creative control, and it showed. Films tackled violence, corruption, addiction, alienation, and existential dread, subjects that were previously off limits. Stories were no longer about heroes and villains, but about people dealing with chaos, trauma, and internal conflict. The style changed too. Camera work became looser, lighting more natural, and sound more raw. Directors often used location shooting instead of studio sets and cast unknown or non-traditional actors. Editing became more fragmented, music choices leaned on rock or jazz, and scenes were allowed to linger without explanation. Films took their time, built atmosphere, and often ended without resolution. Studios gambled, and at first it paid off. Budgets were low, and profits were high. Films aimed at adult audiences found critical and commercial success. The audience was younger and more socially aware, shaped by the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Watergate scandal. These viewers wanted something different, something that didn't talk down to them or hide reality. Films reflected the disillusionment of the time. Box office data became more important than ever. For the first time, studios tracked weekend grosses and began to understand the power of nationwide releases. This led to a shift in how films were marketed and distributed. Directors still had freedom, but now the business side was catching up. By the mid-1970s, directors weren't just storytellers, they were brands. They drew audiences as much as the stars did. Eventually, the same creative freedom that fueled the era also started to hurt it. Budgets grew, productions became chaotic, and some directors lost control. A string of box office flops made studios nervous. The turning point came in the early 1980s when the balance shifted back toward executive control. New Hollywood wasn't dead, but the freewheeling days were coming to an end. Still, the legacy of this era is huge. It redefined what American cinema could be. It brought new voices, diverse stories, and experimental techniques into the mainstream. It proved that challenging material could succeed both artistically and financially. The influence of New Hollywood is still all over today's films, from the use of anti-heroes to the freedom directors have to push boundaries when studios trust them. The blockbuster era. The blockbuster era kicked off in the mid-1970s and reshaped the film industry into what it's largely become today. It started with the release of Jaws in 1975, directed by Steven Spielberg. That film introduced the concept of a nationwide summer release, backed by heavy marketing, massive TV advertising, and wide distribution. 2 years later, Star Wars cemented the formula. These weren't just movies, they were cultural events designed to appeal to the broadest possible audience and rake in huge profits fast. Studios realized they could build anticipation months in advance. Marketing campaigns were launched well before release dates, and merchandising became a major revenue stream. Action figures, t-shirts, lunchboxes, products tied to films started generating billions. By the 1980s, the release calendar had shifted. Summer became prime territory for big-budget, high-concept films. These were movies that could be summed up in one sentence and sold easily to international audiences. Budgets skyrocketed, studios poured tens of millions into visual effects, sound design, and set pieces. At the same time, home video was rising. The VHS boom gave films a second life after theaters, and blockbusters dominated rental charts. This made box office performance only part of a film's success story. Directors like Spielberg, George Lucas, James Cameron, and Ridley Scott became known for delivering spectacle with mass appeal. Sequels, prequels, and franchises started taking over. If a film did well, a follow-up was almost guaranteed. Technology kept evolving. The rise of computer-generated imagery changed everything. Terminator 2 in 1991 and Jurassic Park in 1993 pushed the boundaries of what audiences expected to see on screen. These weren't just big movies, they were technological showcases. Studios partnered with tech companies and effects houses, funneling resources into digital innovation. Audiences came for the visuals as much as the story. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, opening weekend numbers became the industry's key metric. Films started premiering on thousands of screens at once, and midnight openings turned into fan events. Marketing budgets often matched or exceeded production costs. Studios chased four-quadrant appeal, meaning the film needed to attract both men and women, both young and old. That meant action, comedy, romance, and effects all had to be packed into one package. Star power remained important, but brands and intellectual property took the lead. Books, comics, TV shows, and even theme park rides were adapted into blockbusters. Films became part of multimedia ecosystems. Theaters upgraded with stadium seating, surround sound, and larger screens to accommodate the demand for high-quality viewing experiences. Studios began relying on tentpole films to keep their yearly profits afloat. One or two massive hits could offset a slate of underperformers. This era also saw the rise of global markets. Studios began tailoring content to play well internationally. Action and visual spectacle translated across language barriers, so stories became simpler and dialogue lighter. Releases were coordinated worldwide, and box office records were now measured in billions. Titanic, The Lord of the Rings, and The Dark Knight became global juggernauts. The blockbuster era changed how films were made, marketed, and consumed. It shifted power from filmmakers to studios and producers. Risk-averse strategies became standard. Films were tested with focus groups, edited for pacing, and adjusted based on audience feedback. Creativity was still there, but every decision was tied to return on investment. The goal was no longer just telling a story, it was building a phenomenon. The indie boom. The indie boom took off in the late 1980s and surged through the 1990s, driven by a wave of filmmakers operating outside the traditional studio system. These directors worked with small budgets, told personal stories, and ignored commercial formulas. What they lacked in money, they made up for in voice. They used real locations, unknown actors, and dialogue-heavy scripts to focus on character over spectacle. This movement wasn't new, but what changed was the infrastructure that emerged to support it. Film festivals became crucial. Sundance, which had been running since the 1970s, exploded in relevance by the late 80s. It became the launching pad for independent films to get noticed, bought, and distributed. In 1989, Sex, Lies, and Videotape premiered there and won the Audience Award. That film's success proved indie films could be profitable, which got Hollywood's attention fast. Studios created specialty divisions like Miramax, Fox Searchlight, and Sony Pictures Classics to acquire and release indie films under their corporate umbrella. Budgets for these films were often under $10 million. Some were made for less than $1 million. Digital editing and affordable film equipment helped make production more accessible. Distribution remained a challenge, but limited releases in select cities allowed films to build word of mouth before expanding wider. theaters began dedicating screens to indie titles, and video rentals played a major role in keeping these films alive after their theatrical runs. Directors like Quentin Tarantino, Richard Linklater, Kevin Smith, the Coen brothers, and Steven Soderbergh emerged from this wave. Each had a distinct voice and style. Tarantino's scripts were dialogue-heavy and non-linear. Linklater focused on everyday life and human connection. Kevin Smith shot Clerks for under $30,000, mostly using a convenience store and his friends as cast. These films were character-driven, self-aware, and often broke traditional rules of pacing and structure. Independent film wasn't defined by genre but by freedom. It included gritty dramas, offbeat comedies, experimental projects, and deeply personal narratives. Indie filmmakers tackled topics that studios avoided: race, sexuality, addiction, poverty, and mental health, without filters or studio notes. These films gave space to perspectives that had been marginalized, and they resonated with audiences looking for something different. The rise of the home video and cable channels like IFC and Sundance TV created platforms for indie films to reach more viewers. Meanwhile, critics championed the movement. Outlets like Entertainment Weekly and the New York Times covered indie films alongside major releases, helping legitimize them in the eyes of the broader public. The indie boom also fueled a new kind of celebrity. Actors like Ethan Hawke, Parker Posey, and John Turturro became associated with the movement. For many established stars, appearing in an indie film became a way to prove artistic credibility. The box office potential of indie films grew. The Blair Witch Project, released in 1999, was made for around $60,000 and grossed over $200 million worldwide. Pulp Fiction, distributed by Miramax, won the Palme d'Or at Cannes and became a cultural phenomenon. These hits showed that small films could deliver massive returns if marketed the right way. Eventually, the line between independent and studio filmmaking began to blur. Studios started using their indie divisions to test new talent, launch awards campaigns, and reach niche audiences. Indie films became staples during awards season, especially at the Oscar. That attention created more pressure to polish and commercialize, but it also brought larger budgets and wider access for filmmakers who once struggled to get seen. The indie boom redefined success in filmmaking. It proved that audiences didn't always need spectacle, they wanted truth, originality, and voice. It gave a generation of filmmakers their start and reshaped how stories could be told. The streaming age. The streaming age began in the late 2000s and completely restructured how films are released, watched, and even made. When Netflix launched its streaming service in 2007, it started as a place for older films and shows. But within a few years, it turned into the primary way millions of people consumed content. As streaming took over, so did franchises. Marvel films and other major cinematic universes exploded in popularity, and platforms gave them even more reach. Marvel's rise wasn't just theatrical, it was strategic. Starting with Iron Man in 2008, Marvel Studios began crafting a shared universe that played out across multiple films. Every title connected, building toward huge crossover events. Audiences were pulled into long-form storytelling, and each movie felt like an essential chapter. Streaming made it easier to keep up. Fans could watch or rewatch entries at home in order whenever they wanted. That accessibility deepened engagement and expanded the fan base far beyond what box office alone could have done. Disney acquired Marvel in 2009 and quickly aligned theatrical releases with digital plans. When Disney Plus launched in 2019, Marvel content was at the center. Shows like WandaVision, Loki, and The Falcon and the Winter Soldier weren't just side stories. They directly tied into the main films. Fans had to follow both mediums to fully understand the overarching narrative. This model became a blueprint for modern franchise building, blend film and streaming into one continuous universe. The same thing happened across other properties. Star Wars expanded into series like The Mandalorian and Andor, which offered deeper character arcs while staying connected to the larger saga. These shows drew huge viewership numbers and helped retain subscribers. Warner Bros. Used HBO Max to extend the DC universe, while Universal pushed its Fast and Furious and Jurassic World franchises into spin-offs and animated formats. Franchises weren't just surviving in the streaming age, they were thriving. Studios leaned hard into intellectual property. Familiar characters and established brands guaranteed attention. With massive marketing and loyal fan bases, these films became event releases, dominating social media and streaming charts. Algorithms also played a role. Platforms pushed franchise content to the top of homepages. reinforcing their popularity and keeping them constantly in front of users. Films like Avengers Endgame didn't just dominate box offices, they stayed relevant for years through digital availability, memes, and serialized spin-offs. Budgets kept growing. Franchise films often cost over $200 million to make, but they brought in billions globally through box office, streaming rights, merchandise, and licensing. Streaming added an extra layer of profit and exposure. Viewers could dive into entire back catalogs before seeing the newest release, and studios could use data to track what characters or stories resonated most. Streaming also helped international audiences access franchise films instantly. Release dates synced across countries, subtitles and dubs launched on day one, and fans around the world engaged in real time. That global presence pushed franchises even further, making them cultural events that transcended borders. These films weren't just popular, they became massive shared experiences across generations and continents. The streaming age didn't just allow Marvel and franchise films to stay dominant, it turned them into the foundation of modern content strategies. Everything was built around sequels, spin-offs, prequels, and world building. Franchises were no longer limited to theaters, they lived across screens, episodes, and timelines, becoming permanent fixtures in global entertainment. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot here. I would greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe. Thanks for watching.